Hello and welcome to this interview with Michelle Colgrave. Michelle is Professor for Food and Agriculture Proteomics at Edith Cowan University in Perth. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Michelle, in a recent paper, you talk about how insects have been used for millennia to feed people and could be a sustainable source for protein to feed the world's growing population. Can you first share the key findings of your research and what it means for people with shellfish and insect allergies?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I guess the reason we're exploring insects, as you point out, is we've got this growing global population. We're going to have 2 billion extra mouths to feed by 2050. So with that, we need to have additional sources of protein. And insects are fabulous in terms of protein source. They're also rich in many nutrients. They're rich in iron, they're rich in other minerals. And so with that, people are looking to insects as an opportunity to complement our traditional protein industries. And around the world, in fact, about 2 billion people eat insects every day just as part of their standard diet. And there's many jurisdictions where they're very commonplace. So if you go to somewhere like Mexico, they eat crickets regularly. And of course, in Asia, when we travel there, we go to the street stalls and they're chock full of insects of all different types. And in fact, when you think about those insects and you think about what they look like on a skewer, for instance, you could imagine putting a prawn next to a cricket and they don't look too dissimilar. They have the same hard exoskeleton and they also have many similarities because they're quite closely related. So as we look at taxonomy and we sort of go up that taxonomic lineage, they actually come from the same origin. So being close and related, what we wanted to understand was, would they also have similar allergens to seafood and crustacea in particular? And so we used a technique called proteomics, which is the study of proteins using mass spectrometry. And that's something that we use all of the time in food science and agricultural science to really understand the proteins within any crop or food. And in this case, we're starting to look at novel foods. So with this, we looked at the proteins firstly to characterize what was present in an insect. And we've looked at crickets, we've looked at black soldier fly, and we've also looked at mealworms. In this case, we were looking at crickets. And so we were wanting to understand, okay, well, what are those proteins there? And will any of those proteins trigger allergy in people who are shellfish or crustacea allergic? And so when we did that, we firstly characterized the proteins, and then we looked at their sequences because it's specific parts of a protein that trigger allergy. So they bind to receptors within our bodies and then trigger this immune cascade. And so when we did that, we looked at those sequences and we found proteins that were highly similar. And then we said, well, actually, let's go to the next step and see if we can characterize them further. So we took some sera, that's like from the blood of humans who were shellfish allergic, and then treated these proteins to see if they would react with that patient's sera, and they lit up. So we could tell that there's not only is there the potential of these proteins based on their sequence, but we also have that next layer of evidence that says that they actually are interacting with people who would be shellfish allergic.
You also write about discovering allergens in insects under different processing conditions. What did you learn and how can this help food processes? And would you say that the preparation with the least allergens is safe to take for people with allergies?
Yeah, so what we did there was we also looked at how crickets would be processed if you were to eat them, because you're not necessarily just going to pick up a cricket from the side of the street and eat it raw. So oftentimes they'll be roasted, and you could eat them in a whole form if you're very adventurous, or you might actually think about having an insect flour. So you may incorporate that in a baked good. So you could have a cookie, or you could make some bread and you can fortify it with that flour. So we wanted to understand, when you undertake those processes, so when you cook them, will it actually impact on the level of allergenicity? Because when you take a protein and you thermally treat it, it can unfold the sequence. And if it unfolds the sequence, then it may not be allergic or trigger that immune response anymore. And so we wanted to explore that, and we did exactly that. So we looked at different stages of processing that would be used by the food manufacturers. And what we really saw was that there were some differences in the level of the allergen that were present or detected, but overall it was still there at a high level. And so that means that you can't simply eliminate some of these proteins by that, at least that thermal step. And we've seen that in some proteins you can, and because they just fall apart once they're heat treated. But there are other cases where there's proteins that are resistant to that thermal stress, and so they're maintained. And so therefore, that's not going to be just the simple solution to removing the allergen.
And do you think it would be a viable solution for us to remove the problematic allergens from insects, so similar as we do, for gluten in bread? And if so, would you have any ideas how a solution for this could look like?
Yeah, so when we talk about gluten, for instance, so some gluten is an allergen and some gluten is triggers another immune disease known as celiac disease. And so when we think about gluten-free bread, generally it's made from something that's actually not a gluten-containing grain. So you get gluten in wheat and barley and rye, but you don't find it in something like teff or quinoa. So most of those gluten-free products are actually made from something else altogether. You can try to do things like use enzymes to break up the gluten and again remove those parts of the sequence that trigger the reaction. And they have been used with varying degrees of success. But something like lactose, for instance, which is not an allergen per se, but people are intolerant to it, that can be broken down by an enzyme, so lactase. And in that way, you're essentially breaking down two sugars into simple sugars, and that means that your body no longer responds to it, but it's not a true allergen. So when we think about insects and these proteins that exist, we could also try to use enzymes to chop up those sections of the protein. So that would be a different treatment to what I described before. So I talked about thermal processing and how it unfolds the protein. Well, the enzymes act like a molecular scissors, so they can cut at various points. And that means that we could potentially remove or at least lower the allergenicity, but it wouldn't be a surefire solution. So another option we can have is we actually haven't really explored insects in their full potential. There's so many insects in the world that we really don't know which ones would be high with like a high allergenic potential and others that may not have those proteins at all. So we can start to explore the genetic diversity of insects that exist as one option, or we can use new breeding technologies, things like gene editing or CRISPR type technologies that allow us actually to go in and edit those specific sites that would cause allergy. And then that would allow us to actually remove that in somewhat of a brute force manner, but really being able to tailor our interaction with those proteins and remove them completely. But then you have to keep them very much in a closed loop system. So you'd have to have the farming done in a certain way without other insects essentially entering that farming system.
Talking more about the food side of insects, how viable do you think they are in terms of acceptance from more, from more people worldwide to consume as a food, and either as a supplement or as a replacement for other, protein sources such as meat? So, do you anticipate also that we can then also scale the production and that consumption will grow?
Yeah, so what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing really a big pivot, and we're seeing probably the largest transformation of our food systems as we know it. So we're seeing people being concerned about the impact of their diets on the planet. So as I said before, we've got 2 billion extra mouths to feed. So how are we going to do that? Well, we need our traditional sources of protein because they provide some amazing nutrition, especially in developing countries where anemia and other malnutrition are really important parts of sort of the nutrition. But then as we go beyond that, we're seeing things like plant-based proteins have really emerged as another complementary source of protein. And then people are getting more and more interested in novel sources. So whether they're getting protein from things like algae or from insects. And so insects are amazing in that you can utilize them and you can farm them on food waste. So you can think about all those scraps that are coming through our food system or food that would otherwise be lost. Some of it could be from production loss. Some of it's just the vegetables that at retail that don't make it. So we have ugly fruit and vegetables in our retail here, but of course, some of that can't be sold either. So you can start to actually farm these insects on that food waste and transform that food waste into high value protein and these other nutrients that I mentioned. So people are pretty excited about the idea, but what we're seeing at the moment is that there's a different demographic. So oftentimes it's younger people who are looking to these alternative sources of protein and then wanting to incorporate in their diet. Now, not everyone is going to be one of those 2 billion people who's eating insects every day. Some people won't want to have, a dish where it's whole insects and center of the plate. They may be more interested in a product that's fortified with protein, like in a bread or a cookie or in other products, where they don't actually have to face, putting the whole insect in their mouth, and it just becomes another ingredient within our food system. And I think that's where it's got the greatest potential.
Michelle, it was great to have you. Let me wish you continued success with your further research. Very exciting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.